The story we're going to talk about today shocked the whole world with its cruelty. It happened just over 40 years ago, and despite the multitude of films, series, and documentaries made about it, it's still unclear what exactly happened. The circumstances and details of this story are still being investigated to this day. This is the story of the Atlanta children. This is History's Omitted. You're on a channel that explains interesting stories. In July 1979, the bodies of two black children were found on the outskirts of Atlanta. One of them died from strangulation, the other from a gunshot wound. There were no signs of sexual assault. However, at the time, no one paid much attention to these murders. The fact is that both teenagers, despite their young age of 14, were members of a street gang. And this gang was very eager to get involved in the active drug business. But the police discovered another interesting detail. Pieces of blue carpet fiber were found on the bodies of both teenagers. And here's the problem. None of the victims had similar floor covering in their homes. However, at the time, the police didn't pay serious attention to this detail. A month and a half later, another child disappeared. A boy went to pay the rent at a bank 1.5 kilometers from his home, but never reached the bank. As a result, the police caught some exhibitionists and other shady individuals, but never found the real killer. You can probably guess that this was only the beginning. Soon, another child was killed, Joseph Bell. The investigation, for some reason, decided that his mentally unstable father, who had kidnapped the child from the mother, was to blame. As a result, the father ended up in a mental hospital, and the boy's body was found in the basement of an abandoned school. Again, no signs of sexual assault, and again, strangulation. Atlanta slept peacefully for a year, but in March 1980, a 2-year-old girl didn't return home. She was found tied to a tree with an electrical cord. And again, pieces of carpet fiber were found on her body, which, as you might guess, she didn't have at home, along with traces of dog hair. Later, the police found out that the 2-year-old girl had been working as a prostitute for several months. As the case gained momentum, the Atlanta police kept catching pedophiles and people with mental disorders, but all to no avail. The murders continued. In just 1 year, 12 children were killed in Atlanta. All these children came from troubled families. And as you might guess, their socialization was also very specific. That is, they grew up on the streets, and drinking and smoking were clearly not the worst things they learned there. Obviously, their parents simply didn't care about them. But not all of them. After another murder, some parents united into a kind of committee. But first and foremost, it was for the safety of the city where their children had recently lived. But it didn't help much. The number of murders only grew. Ultimately, this committee began to resemble a political union. The parents were convinced that white racists from the Ku Klux Klan were involved in the murders, and conspiracy theories became more and more numerous. Rallies and strikes, with an intensity not much different from the recent events in Baltimore, had the whole city on edge. A full-blown political rebellion. Residents vented their anger as best they could. You might say that suspecting racists is just ordinary conspiracy theory, sometimes. But if you look at the historical context, what happened in Atlanta becomes even more interesting. Atlanta is the capital of Georgia. Georgia is a fairly old state, founded in the 18th century. And overall, Atlanta historically isn't poor, but you can't say it's a very rich center of an agrarian region. The city's active development began just before World War II. Frankly, it ended around the same time. 10 years before the murders, a major population outflow from Atlanta began. What about the population? Half of Atlanta's residents were black, and a little less than half were white. And the division between these two groups ran right through the center of the city. It's not hard to guess that these areas were known for their traditions of slavery. Georgia was one of the centers of the Confederacy during the US Civil War. But the Civil War happened back in the 19th century. Slavery was abolished, thanks in part to Abraham Lincoln. But problems remained. No one explained to the former slaves what to do with their newfound freedom. And then came the men in ridiculous white robes waiting for them. One of the largest Ku Klux Klan groups in the US was formed in Georgia. They were active in the 19th and early 20th centuries, but after World War II, the situation changed. Being an open racist simply became shameful. But you must understand that these sentiments couldn't evaporate in an instant. The social roots of all this were too deep. Speaking of roots, since the beginning of the 20th century, Jim Crow laws reigned in Atlanta. Simply put, these were laws of racial segregation. How did they work? Black people were called an oppressed race that needed to be safely integrated into white society. How to do that? It was necessary to create a certain protected space where if you were black, you could use all social benefits, but please, separately. This was presented as follows. It's not that we are protecting ourselves from them, but rather them from us. As if the situation was exactly the opposite. What needs to be understood? For that time, the ideas of segregation, whites separate, blacks separate, were considered almost groundbreaking. This model itself was called the Atlanta Compromise. Now let's imagine the ordinary life of an ordinary black guy. Need to go to the hospital? Please, but to a clinic for black people. Tired of standing on the bus? No problem, but only behind the sign that restricts seats for black people closer to the end of the bus. Want a haircut? Also no problem, but please go to a black barber. And so it was in every sphere of life. These rules were only abolished in the mid-60 seconds, that is, 15 years before the series of terrible murders. They were abolished, but the stratification of society didn't go away. All the money still belonged mostly to whites. And in the mid-70 seconds, the unemployment rate among the black population reached 35%. What happens when people face total poverty and unemployment every day? Here are a couple of quotes from newspapers of that time. One businessman who went to work early in the morning suffered a broken arm while fighting off a homeless person who attacked him. The murder statistics in Atlanta were simply catastrophic. 45 per 100,000 population. But to give you some perspective, I think you've understood that the soil for conspiracy theories in these conditions is simply ideal. You have no job, you had no proper education, you can be attacked around the nearest corner and robbed not just of the money you barely have, but of your life. So it's no surprise that all these fears about white racists emerged. Not only is the social situation depressing, but people also have all these memories of lynchings and other joys from the past in their heads. Now, I hope you understand where the theme of racists came from and why it started to gain traction so quickly in Atlanta at the turn of the 70 seconds and 80 seconds. So, in 1 year, 12 children were killed in Atlanta. The killer walked the streets completely calmly, and the police couldn't do anything. Soviet propaganda took advantage of this. President Reagan was called a white racist. He cut all social programs for the black population, didn't want to give money to the police, and overall, this whole story was a conspiracy against the black population of Georgia. That's what Soviet newspapers wrote. Soviet propaganda could have continued to criticize their overseas counterparts for a long time if the FBI hadn't taken over the case. And not just the FBI, but a secret department of criminal profilers. Let's figure out what profiling is and how these profilers worked in Atlanta. Profiling is a branch of criminology based on psychology. Here's how one former Secret Service employee talks about it. We step in when criminologists can't cope. If we study how the crime happened, we will understand why it happened. And that will lead us to who committed the crime. Many, for some reason, are sure that a profiler is a hybrid of Sherlock Holmes and Sigmund Freud, that his task is to find the criminal. The answer is no. His task is not to find a specific criminal. His task is to draw up a psychological portrait of him. What was his childhood like? What were his relationships with classmates? Was he hit at school with a pointer or something else? Did he torture cats and dogs? In general, how his upbringing and process of socialization were built. That's the kind of thorough portrait a profiler must produce after his work. It must be said that this method is not a panacea and wasn't one back then. There was already evidence that when trying to solve series of crimes, including series of sexually motivated crimes, profilers came to completely erroneous conclusions. For example, there was the story of the Boston Strangler. He strangled 13 women in the 60 seconds, and profilers for some reason decided the Strangler was a repressed homosexual. In the end, it turned out he wasn't homosexual at all. He was married and killed random women. A study from the 2000s generally showed that profilers aren't much better in their talents and results than regular police. But let's remember this. There are stock traders, and statistics show they are right maybe 55% of the time. And those 5% of cases that determine whether you lose money or earn, it often turn out to be key. It's the same story with profiling. The probability that your methods will be correct, that the killer is the one who matches your psychological portrait, is not 100%. But in the case of Atlanta, this very method became a breakthrough. Our main hero with a plus sign is John Douglas, the founding father of criminal profiling. He and his partner arrived in Atlanta when 16 teenagers had already been killed. Of course, they immediately rushed into battle and started digging through the archives. What did they get? They came up with 2 psychological portraits that strongly coincided with each other. And the conclusions from these psychological portraits drawn up by the profilers greatly displeased the victims' parents and the general public of Atlanta. First, the first thing they established was that it was definitely not the Klan. The hypothesis of white racists was dismissed. Why? Murder on racial grounds, strictly speaking, is terrorism. If a terrorist wants to be remembered, if he wants to show that yes, he committed the murder, he is guilty of all the crimes, obviously he won't hide his identity. Not that he will walk around waving his ID, but he will definitely say that this or that organization is behind the crimes. In this case, no one claimed responsibility. Obviously, the white hoods that Klan members wear are not for hiding from the sun's rays. For them, it's a symbol. There were no racist symbols, no letters to editorial offices, no appeals to the mass media. The racism hypothesis was dropped. The second important finding, the killer was most likely black. And here, a social experiment was conducted that confirmed this hypothesis. The police sent cops, both white and black, into predominantly black neighborhoods. And for $5, they asked these cops to find black boys to help them with a small task. What did the social experiment show? In almost 100% of cases, if a black cop approached a child, the child did everything required of him. Elementary trust was established. That is, of course, if a white policeman had asked for something, something might have come of it too. But with a black cop, it worked 10 times out of 10. Of course, there was overwhelming poverty in these areas. And $5, if you have no electricity in your house, is really a lot of money, especially if you don't earn anything. Especially if you're a teenager. In the end, Douglas and his colleague compiled a detailed psychological portrait of the killer. First, the killer was clearly seeking communication with children and teenagers to obtain so-called compensation. That is, the respect or recognition, or at least to have someone to talk to, which he didn't get or couldn't get in the adult world. Second conclusion, the killer clearly had problems with income and education. He was most likely from a poor family and had no proper education. Third, if the killer were too old or looked too adult, the children probably wouldn't be able to talk to him. There simply wouldn't be that trust, as was the case with the black cops in these areas. So with one child, it might have worked, but with the other children, this scenario would have been impossible. Therefore, the profilers were sure. The killer was clearly young, definitely under 30. And finally, the last point. The compensation we mentioned above worked not only in terms of seeking recognition or some respect among teenagers and children, it also worked in a strange fixation on militaristic or police attributes. The profilers decided that the killer must be inclined to collect elements characteristic of the police. Perhaps he even had the same dog as the police, a German Shepherd. The portrait was ready. Meanwhile, the whole country was talking about the children from Atlanta. Everyone was talking, including celebrities. Frank Sinatra gave charity concerts. Coca-Cola released special collector cards that told children to never get into a car with strangers. And the mayor of Atlanta promised $100,000 for help in catching the killer. And here's what our profiler Douglas noticed. Obviously, the killer didn't just follow media publications about his crimes, he was literally a fan of them. And not just a fan, he tried to influence them. He understood that, for example, searches were going on in some district. Local newspapers and television reported this. So, out of spite, having thoroughly concealed himself in the dark of night, he committed crimes precisely there to show that he could do it, despite all the precautions, despite the active police searches going on there. Out of spite, he went against the entire investigation and literally mocked it. Meanwhile, the number of victims was no longer 12, not 16, not 20, but 26. And Douglas decided that the killer might commit his next crime by dumping a body in the river to hide the evidence, because the streets were full of cops, all the woods were being combed, and the whole of Atlanta was still on its ears. Round the clock, police patrols were set up on all the bridges. And that same day, one of the policemen on patrol near the Chattahoochee River noticed the following. First, he heard a loud splash, as if something had been thrown into the river. He saw a car that was stopped on the bridge at the time make a sharp police U-turn and drive away quickly. The car was identified. The person behind the wheel was named Wayne Williams. Williams turned out to be a 2-3-year-old black guy. He wasn't rude to the police. He was quite polite and explained his strange behavior on the bridge as follows. He had an interview with some music producer in the morning, and so, to make sure he was on time, he decided to check the route at night, or more precisely, at 2 in the morning. While he was giving this original version, the police decided to see what was in the car. There, they found a shovel and gloves. The police didn't have enough evidence to detain Williams on the spot, so they let him go, but the police had the opportunity to look at and inspect the car more carefully. And despite the fact that Williams had managed to wash his car, the police were able to find something very valuable there. Traces from the children they were looking for and who were found murdered. On the 21st of June 1981, Wayne Williams was arrested on suspicion of murder. What kind of person was he? Unlike many of his peers, Wayne Williams was from a middle-income family, but he never found a normal job. He built his own homemade radio station at home and was very interested in music. On this basis, he met various people, mostly young, and he considered himself a talented music producer or even a DJ. And Williams was also known as a pathological liar. He told lies even for minor reasons, and when someone exposed this lie, Williams literally exploded. He threw tantrums, screamed, and raged like a wounded animal. I think you've already gathered that this didn't quite exactly match the profiler's portrait. But you know what's interesting? The last detail the profilers noted in their psychological portrait, namely the killer's fixation on all sorts of police or military attributes, played out 100% here. The fact is that sometime before, Williams had been detained at a crime scene where he was impersonating a cop. He didn't commit the crime, but for some reason he decided to play policeman here. Well, about the decommissioned police car and the German Shepherd, I think it goes without saying. By a strange coincidence with the portrait, Williams had a police car and he had a German Shepherd. When the trial began, the prosecution ran into unexpected difficulties. Williams presented himself as a goody two-shoes. Well, you can look at what he looked like. Thin arms, very polite, wearing glasses, he couldn't make a bad impression on anyone. And he communicated with everyone very tactfully, answering all the questions he was asked. It would seem, what can you do with this? Besides the hairs found in his car, there were no direct evidences yet. So Williams actively communicated with the press, said that racists were to blame, that they wanted to make him a scapegoat, and the press actively spread all these interviews. The only thing Williams couldn't explain was how the hairs of 12 murdered children ended up in his car. And Douglas started thinking about a provocation, about something that could show Williams' true nature, which his old acquaintances talked about. The turning point in the trial happened again thanks to the profiler. Douglas spied this tactic in some old TV show. The likely killer was a restrained person, but nevertheless prone to hysterics. Therefore, he needed to be exposed. How to do it? He needed to be asked a lot of questions about his childhood, literally going through his entire biography, asking him about how he grew up, how many friends he had. Literally, for every step of his biography, there should be questions that should exhaust him, and such an interrogation should last at least several hours. And at the end of such an interrogation, the secret weapon could be used. He could be asked something most important, most decisive, that would set him off. The prosecutor, on Douglas's advice, did just that. He tormented Williams with questions for a very long time, and when he was tired at the right moment, he approached him very closely, touched his hand, and asked, "Tell me, what did you feel when you were squeezing the victim's throat? Did you feel even the slightest panic?" And at that, the polite Williams simply exploded. He started screaming, attacking the prosecutor. He threw a tantrum that no one present expected. Everyone was used to a completely different image. The goody two-shoes and glasses with a homemade radio station at home, who for some reason met guys on the basis of music. No one expected such behavior. The jury finally understood that if a person accused of such a serious crime explodes in response to a question about violence, then something is not clean here. In February 1982, Wayne Williams was given 2 life sentences for 2 murders. They couldn't prove more. To be clear, by that time, 28 teenagers and children had been killed in Atlanta, but with Williams' capture, the murders stopped. It seemed that was it. Case closed. But the parents of the murdered children were sure that the verdict had been written even before the trial began. There were 2 arguments. First, Williams was obviously made a scapegoat. And second, one person simply couldn't commit all these crimes alone, especially when President Ronald Reagan, who was called a white racist. And if it suddenly turned out that the killer was actually white, then a full-scale racial street war of destruction would break out in Atlanta and perhaps in other US cities. The problem was also that the profiler Douglas himself claimed that Williams was involved in 11 murders, but not all 28. The prosecution constantly talked about the fact that Williams had that blue carpet at home, that Williams had a dog at home, and that the DNA results spoke for themselves. But in the 80 seconds, the entire DNA analysis procedure was very primitive, and now we hear news that there were many false positive convictions for which people went to prison for very, very long terms. The conspiracy theory didn't go away even after Williams was sentenced to life. A version circulated among the people that the murders were actually committed by the Ku Klux Klan. The FBI conducted a secret investigation for this very reason and confirmed it all, but again, so that there wouldn't be a full-scale racial war in the streets, all this information was swept under the rug and no one was told about the results of the investigation. In the 2000s, Americans conducted a more modern study of the DNA tests found on the bodies of the murdered children. If you now type the killer's last name in Google in Latin, one of the first top results will be Williams' DNA. This topic is still the most discussed in Williams' case. And these DNA tests showed that the probability that the particles found on the bodies of the murdered children belonged to anyone other than Williams was 0.8%. Very low. Moreover, the dog hair found also turned out to be rare. Only 1 in 100 dogs has that type of hair. Despite all this, Williams, almost 40 years after the verdict, claims he is innocent. Here's what he looked like in a CNN interview about 10 years ago. He still insists that he is not acquainted with the victims, that he called them nobodies in the heat of the moment, and that overall he has been made a scapegoat again. But the story doesn't end there. Not long ago, the newly minted mayor of Atlanta vowed to conduct a new investigation to achieve justice. Williams himself contacted the victims' parents and wished them luck in the new investigation. However Jesuitical that may sound, The results were promised to be published this summer, but for some reason, at the very last moment, they decided not to rush. Thank you for watching until the end. If you liked it, subscribe to the channel. A new video will be out very soon. Thank you for watching. See you.